Artem Rutsov, a 38-year-old billionaire, was a man who seemed to have everything. A self-made magnate, his life was one of power, control, and opulence. His sprawling estate, perched atop a hill overlooking the city, reflected his success, with its towering glass walls and immaculate gardens that never knew a single flaw. Artem's days were filled with decisive boardroom meetings, glittering galas, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had climbed to the top of the world, leaving behind a turbulent past. But beneath the polished veneer of his life, cracks had begun to form. The first was subtle. His wife, Diana, whom he had married 6 years ago, seemed different. She was no longer the charming and witty woman who had once captivated him at a charity ball. Over the past year, Diana had grown distant, almost as though she had drifted into a world where he could not follow. Late-night returns, muted phone calls she ended the moment he entered the room, and that haunting, absent look in her eyes each was a small but undeniable thread unraveling the tapestry of their life together. Artem tried to ignore it. He told himself that he was overthinking, that Diana's behavior was the natural ebb and flow of any marriage. After all, he was a busy man, too preoccupied with the volatile energy markets and ambitious expansions of his business empire to dwell on the peculiarities of his wife's actions. Yet a nagging feeling gnawed at the edges of his mind, growing stronger each time he noticed something that didn't fit. It wasn't just her distance. Diana had started asking strange questions about his family's history, questions he didn't think were relevant to their lives. She had shown an unusual interest in a room he rarely entered, the private study left untouched since his father's death years ago. It was as though she was peeling back layers of his past, searching for something. Then came the evening when the doubts coalesced into a stark, unshakable truth. It was a cold night in early autumn. The wind whispered through the cracks in the window panes, and Artem, restless from the stresses of a turbulent week at work, decided to take a rare evening off. Diana wasn't home. She had left earlier, mentioning an appointment that Artem didn't recall her scheduling. Alone in their cavernous bedroom, he absently tidied up the space. It was then that he found it. Tucked into the back of her walk-in closet, hidden beneath neatly folded designer scarves, was a small leather-bound book. Its pages were worn, the edges faintly yellowed, and the scent of aged paper filled the air as Artem flipped it open. The handwriting was delicate, precise, and unmistakably Diana's. The first few pages seemed harmless enough, lists, reflections, even poetry. But as he read further, his pulse quickened. The words took on a darker tone, filled with bitterness and anger. One entry froze him in place. He thinks I'm his partner, but he's wrong. He's as blind as his father was. They all are. Soon he'll understand what it feels like to lose everything. Artem's mind raced. Who was this woman? This was not the Diana he thought he knew. The words felt like shards of glass, slicing through the carefully constructed image of his perfect marriage. He couldn't reconcile the loving, supportive wife he'd lived with for years with the venom in these pages. He read on, his breathing shallow, his hands trembling. There were references to meetings with shadowy figures, cryptic plans involving his business empire, and veiled threats that seemed to hint at something catastrophic. But it wasn't until he reached a specific passage that his heart truly sank. The first step will begin on the anniversary. He doesn't suspect a thing. By the time he realizes, it will be too late. The anniversary. Their wedding anniversary was in just 3 days. Artem sat down heavily, the diary clutched in his hands. His mind replayed every interaction he'd had with Diana over the past year. The late nights, the phone calls, the sudden interest in his family history. It all fit into a puzzle he hadn't even known existed. His wife wasn't simply distant, she was planning something. Something terrible. But why? The question hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and insidious. Artem's relationship with Diana had always been smooth, even enviable. They had met when he was already successful, but she had seemed uninterested in his wealth or status. She had been the one person who treated him like a man, not a tycoon. Had it all been an act? Was their marriage nothing more than a carefully orchestrated illusion? Unable to sit still, Artem rose and paced the room, the weight of the diary pressing on his mind. He needed answers. He needed to know who Diana truly was, and why she was so intent on the secretive, vengeful path. And most of all, he needed to understand what she meant by the first step. For the first time in his life, Artem felt powerless. He had spent decades building walls of control around himself, meticulously curating every aspect of his life. But now, those walls felt fragile, on the verge of collapse. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke his thoughts. Diana was home. Artem quickly slipped the diary back into its hiding spot and composed himself. When Diana walked through the door, her face was serene, her smile practiced. She asked about his day as though nothing was amiss, but Artem saw it now, the carefully measured distance in her tone, the slight hesitation in her gestures. He forced a smile in return, his mind a whirlwind of questions and fears. Whatever game Diana was playing, he would uncover it. For now, he had to bide his time, pretending to be the trusting husband she believed him to be. But as Artem lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, one thought consumed him. If Diana truly meant to destroy him, he would need to stop her first. This was no longer just about their marriage. This was about survival. The morning after Artem discovered Diana's diary, the world around him felt like a meticulously constructed stage, with every interaction layered in duplicity. As he sat in the quiet luxury of his study, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, the diary's cryptic entries played over and over in his mind. He had read enough to know that Diana wasn't just distancing herself, she was actively working against him. But the question of why gnawed at him like a persistent ache. The pages hinted at shadowy alliances and veiled plans, but the heart of her motivations eluded him. The date mentioned in her entries 3 days from now cast a looming shadow over his thoughts. If the first step of her plan was set to begin on their anniversary, he had little time to act. He spent the morning combing through recent memories, searching for anything that might provide a clue. Diana's peculiar interest in his family history now seemed more than idle curiosity. Her probing questions about his father's company, her frequent visits to his private study, and her sudden fascination with old photographs now felt ominously deliberate. Artem's father, Konstantin Rutsov, had built the foundation of their family's wealth, but his legacy was far from pristine. Konstantin's name was whispered with equal parts reverence and fear in business circles, a man whose ruthless ambition had destroyed competitors and amassed fortunes at the cost of untold lives. Had Diana uncovered something buried in that history? Artem decided he couldn't face this alone. Trusting anyone in his inner circle was out of the question, but he knew someone who might help without asking too many questions. His old friend and private investigator, Maxim Zhukov, had been invaluable during the more sensitive negotiations of Artem's career. Maxim was loyal but detached, a man who understood the complexities of power and the weight of silence. That afternoon, Artem called Maxim to his estate. The two men sat in the study, the air thick with unspoken tension. Maxim, a wiry man with a sharp gaze, leaned back in his chair, assessing Artem with a calm curiosity. "You don't usually call me unless something's burning," Maxim said, a trace of humor in his voice. Artem slid the diary across the desk. "It's worse than that," he replied. Maxim flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from curiosity to grim concentration. He paused at several entries, rereading them carefully before closing the diary and setting it back on the desk. "This isn't just a grudge," Maxim said, his tone measured. Whoever your wife is working with, they're organized. You don't write something like this unless you're certain it's going to work. Artem nodded. That's what I'm afraid of. She's been digging into my family's past, specifically my father's dealings. If she's found something I don't even know about. He trailed off, the weight of the implication hanging in the air. Have you confronted her? Maxim asked. No, Artem said quickly. Not yet. I can't. If she knows I'm onto her, she might escalate. Whatever this first step is, it's set for 3 days from now. I need to know what she's planning before then. Maxim tapped his fingers against the desk thoughtfully. All right, let me start with the basics. I'll dig into her financials, her communications, anything that might give us a lead. But you should be careful, Artem. If she's this deep into it, she's not working alone. And people with plans this intricate don't stop just because they're caught. As Maxim left, Artem felt a glimmer of relief. He wasn't alone in this anymore, but the clock was still ticking. He couldn't afford to sit idle while Maxim worked. That evening, Artem decided to search Diana's belongings himself. While she was out at one of her frequent appointments, he slipped into her personal study. The room was immaculate, with its minimalist design and muted tones. Artem knew Diana valued order, which made his task more difficult. Anything out of place would immediately alert her. He started with the drawers of her desk, finding little beyond neatly arranged stationery and innocuous documents. Then he moved to her bookshelves, scanning the spines for anything unusual. His eyes landed on a small, leather-bound book tucked behind a row of novels. Pulling it out, he discovered it wasn't a book at all but a hollowed-out case. Inside was a USB drive. Artem's pulse quickened. He took the drive and plugged it into the laptop he had brought with him. The files inside were encrypted, but one folder was accessible. It contained dozens of scanned documents, ledgers, contracts, and photographs. As he scrolled through them, a pattern began to emerge. The documents painted a damning picture of his father's business practices, bribes, coercion, and worse. One photograph, in particular, made his blood run cold. His father standing next to a man Artem recognized as Viktor Melnichenko, a notorious figure in the criminal underworld of the 1990s. Artem had heard whispers of his father's dealings with Melnichenko, but had always dismissed them as rumors. Yet here was undeniable proof of their partnership. And if Diana had these files, it meant she had been working to uncover the darker side of his family's empire for years. Among the documents was an invoice dated nearly 2 decades ago, listing assets seized from a family named Lobanov. The name meant nothing to Artem at first, but as he scanned the details, he realized the assets had included a modest business, a small manufacturing firm, and a family home. Both had been absorbed into the Rutsov portfolio under dubious circumstances. It hit him like a blow to the chest. Diana's maiden name was Lobanova. The room seemed to close in around him as the pieces clicked into place. Diana wasn't just his wife, she was the daughter of a family his father had destroyed, and now she was exacting her revenge, not through violence but through meticulously orchestrated ruin. Artem felt a wave of nausea. He had married a woman who had spent years plotting his downfall, and he hadn't seen it coming. But as the initial shock wore off, another thought surfaced. Diana wasn't acting alone. The scale of her plan, the resources it required, it was too much for one person. She had allies, likely people who had also suffered under his father's reign, and they had chosen their moment carefully, targeting Artem at the height of his power. He closed the laptop and carefully returned the hollow book to its place. His mind raced as he left the study, replaying the revelations he had uncovered. That night, as Diana returned home and greeted him with her usual practiced warmth, Artem could barely bring himself to look at her. Her smile, once comforting, now felt like the mask of a predator. She moved through the house with the grace of someone who had everything under control, while Artem felt as though the ground beneath him was crumbling. He had 3 days to dismantle a plan that had been years in the making. 3 days to stop the woman he once loved from destroying everything he had built. And yet, as he lay awake in bed, another thought lingered. What if I deserve this? Artem's discovery of Diana's true motives had shattered every foundation of trust he thought existed between them. The woman he had cherished, built a life with, was a carefully constructed illusion. For 6 years she had shared his bed, his secrets, his empire, all while plotting its destruction. But Artem wasn't the kind of man to surrender to despair. As the pieces of her plan began to surface, he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just personal revenge, it was an orchestrated dismantling of everything the Rutsov name stood for. That morning, he called Maxim Zhukov, his most trusted ally, to his estate. Maxim arrived within the hour, his sharp gaze immediately catching the tension etched into Artem's face. Maxim was the kind of man who operated in shadows, accustomed to dealing with threats most people wouldn't dare acknowledge. As Artem laid out the details, the diary, the documents, the ties to Viktor Melnichenko, Maxim's expression turned grim. Viktor, Maxim repeated, leaning back in his chair. If he's involved, this isn't just about you. He's been circling like a vulture ever since your father cut ties with him. And Diana? She's the perfect inside player. No one would suspect the dutiful wife. Except I do now, Artem said coldly. And I need to know everything before she makes her next move. Maxim nodded. I'll start with her communications. If she's been working with Viktor, there'll be a trail. These kinds of operations always leave fingerprints, you just have to know where to look. While Maxim began his investigation, Artem was left to grapple with the reality of his situation. Diana's motives were no longer a mystery, but her endgame remained unclear. The diary hinted at something catastrophic set to occur on their anniversary, just 2 days away. If he didn't act fast, she would destroy him before he even understood the full scope of her plan. That evening, Artem decided to test the waters. He invited Diana to dinner at one of their favorite restaurants, an exclusive rooftop venue where they had celebrated countless milestones. If she suspected that he knew about her plans, she didn't show it. She arrived dressed impeccably, her poise as effortless as ever. Artem watched her closely throughout the meal, noting every detail, the slight hesitation in her laughter, the way her eyes flickered with calculation when he brought up memories of their past. You've always been so good at staying composed, he said, swirling his wine. Even when things get tense. It's one of the things I admire most about you. Diana smiled, her expression warm but guarded. Is that your way of saying I'm too serious? Not at all, Artem replied smoothly. I just think there's more to you than you let on. Even after all these years, you're still a mystery to me. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Mystery keeps things interesting, doesn't it? Artem leaned forward, holding her gaze, sometimes. But sometimes it's dangerous. The air between them thickened, the unspoken tension crackling like electricity. Diana's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, laughing softly. You've always had a flair for the dramatic, Artem. As they left the restaurant, Artem couldn't shake the feeling that Diana was aware of his suspicions. She walked beside him with the grace of someone in complete control, her arm linked loosely with his. But he knew better now. Every touch, every smile, was a weapon she wielded with precision. The breakthrough came the following morning. Maxim, ever efficient, had intercepted a communication between Diana and Viktor. The audio recording was grainy, but clear enough to send a chill down Artem's spine. I want everything ready by the 22nd, Diana's voice said, cold and clipped. No mistakes, Viktor. He's already suspicious. You worry too much, Viktor replied, his tone calm but laced with menace. By the time he figures it out, it'll be over. Artem clenched his fists as he listened, his jaw tightening with each word. The certainty in their voices was chilling. They weren't just planning, they were confident in their success. "We need to act now," Maxim said as he stopped the recording. "If this goes unchecked, you'll lose everything: your company, your reputation, maybe even your life." "How do we stop them?" Artem asked, his voice low but steady. "We hit Victor first," Maxim said. "Take out his funding. Without money, his operation falls apart." "And Diana?" Maxim hesitated. "She's going to realize you're onto her. Be prepared for her to retaliate." That evening, Artem decided to confront Diana indirectly. He arranged for a private dinner at home, setting the stage for a subtle interrogation. Diana arrived late, as she often did these days, her demeanor calm but her eyes sharper than usual. As they sat across from each other in the dimly lit dining room, Artem began probing her with carefully crafted questions. "You've been so busy lately," he said casually. "I barely see you anymore." Diana smiled, tilting her head. "You know how it is. Charity events, appointments, it's all so tedious." "And yet you're always glowing afterward," Artem replied, his tone light but pointed. "It makes me wonder what keeps you so energized." Her smile tightened. "Are you accusing me of something, Artem?" "Should I be?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. For a moment, the mask slipped. Diana's eyes darkened, her smile fading into a thin line. "You've always been paranoid," she said softly. "It's one of your less endearing qualities." "And you've always been so good at hiding things," Artem countered. "Tell me, Diana, how much longer do you think you can keep this up?" The tension between them was palpable, the air heavy with unspoken accusations. Diana rose abruptly, her movements precise and deliberate. "I think this conversation is over," she said, her voice icy. "Not yet," Artem said, standing to face her. "You've been lying to me for years. I know about Victor. I know about your father. I know everything." Diana froze, her back to him. When she turned, her expression was unreadable. "Then you know why this has to happen." Her words sent a chill through him. "It doesn't," he said firmly. "We can end this now. Whatever you're planning, we can stop it together." Diana laughed, the sound cold and bitter. "Stop it? It's already in motion, Artem. You can't undo what's been set in place." "Why, Diana?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why do this?" Her gaze hardened. "Because your family took everything from mine. You think you've built an empire, but it's all blood and ashes. I'm just returning the favor." As she turned to leave, Artem called after her. "Diana, don't make me stop you." She paused in the doorway, glancing back at him with a faint smile. "You can try, Artem, but you won't win." And with that, she was gone, leaving Artem alone in the silence of the dining room. The battle lines had been drawn, and time was running out. He knew now that Diana's plan was bigger than he had imagined, and if he didn't act fast, she would destroy everything he held dear. Artem sat alone in his private study, the flickering glow of the fireplace casting long shadows across the walls. His world was crumbling faster than he could piece it back together. Diana's words echoed in his mind. "You can try, Artem, but you won't win." She hadn't just been confident, she'd been certain. Her plan was in motion, and she believed there was nothing he could do to stop it. The following morning, Maxim delivered more disturbing news. Through his network, he had intercepted additional communications between Diana and her allies, confirming that the first major move in her plan would take place during their anniversary dinner, less than 24 hours away. The messages hinted at something public, something designed to humiliate Artem and strip him of his credibility. "She's not just targeting your reputation," Maxim explained, pacing the room. "She's going after your empire, your legacy. This isn't just revenge, it's annihilation." Artem clenched his fists. "What's the next step?" "We need to disrupt her coordination with Victor," Maxim replied. "He's the linchpin. Without him, her resources and allies crumble. I've tracked his location to a private estate outside the city. If we can reach him before tomorrow night, we can force his hand, or at least buy ourselves time. Maxim's plan was simple but dangerous: infiltrate Victor's estate and extract the information needed to derail Diana's operation. Artem agreed without hesitation. He wasn't just fighting for his company or his name, he was fighting for his survival. That evening, Artem and Maxim drove to the outskirts of the city, the urban sprawl giving way to dense forests and winding roads. Victor's estate loomed ahead, a sprawling fortress surrounded by high walls and patrolled by armed guards. Maxim parked the car in a secluded spot, pulling out a map of the estate. "We'll go in through the south entrance," he said, pointing to a section of the wall obscured by overgrown foliage. "There's a blind spot in the cameras there. Once we're inside, we head straight for Victor's office. He keeps his most sensitive documents there." Artem nodded, his jaw set. He wasn't a man accustomed to operating in shadows, but desperation had stripped him of his usual reservations. As they made their way through the darkened forest, the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on his shoulders. The infiltration went smoothly at first. Maxim's expertise in surveillance and stealth was evident as they navigated the estate's perimeter, avoiding the guards and security cameras. But as they approached the main building, Artem's heart began to race. Every step brought him closer to the man who had been pulling the strings behind Diana's plan. Inside the estate, the atmosphere was oppressive. The corridors were dimly lit, the walls adorned with expensive artwork that seemed to mock Artem's predicament. They reached Victor's office without incident, Maxim expertly bypassing the electronic lock on the door. The room was a testament to Victor's power. A massive oak desk dominated the space, flanked by shelves filled with books and folders. Maxim immediately began searching through the documents, while Artem stood by the door, his ears straining for any sign of approaching footsteps. Minutes felt like hours as Maxim worked, his movements swift and efficient. Finally, he pulled out a folder and flipped through its contents, his expression darkening with each page. "This is it," he said, handing the folder to Artem. The documents detailed the full extent of Diana's plan, from the financial sabotage of Artem's company to the public release of damning information about his father's criminal dealings. But what caught Artem's attention was a separate file labeled Contingency. Inside were blueprints of his estate, annotated with chilling precision. "She's planning to move against you directly," Maxim said grimly. "This isn't just about ruining your reputation. They're coming for you." Before Artem could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. Maxim swore under his breath, quickly stashing the documents in his bag. "We need to move. Now." The next few minutes were a blur of tension and adrenaline. Artem and Maxim slipped out of the office just as a group of guards entered the corridor. They barely managed to avoid detection, ducking into a side room and waiting for the guards to pass. The escape was harrowing, but they eventually made it back to the car, the stolen documents clutched tightly in Maxim's hands. As they drove back to the city, Artem reviewed the files in silence, his mind racing. The scale of Diana's operation was staggering. She had orchestrated alliances with powerful figures, each of whom stood to gain from his downfall. But it was the contingency plan that unsettled him the most. "She's not just working with Victor," Artem said, breaking the silence. "There's someone else involved. Someone with intimate knowledge of my estate, my routines." Maxim frowned. "A mole?" Artem nodded. "It has to be. Someone inside my inner circle is feeding her information." The realization sent a wave of anger through him. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to surround himself with loyal, trustworthy people. The thought that one of them had betrayed him was a bitter pill to swallow. Back at his estate, Artem immediately convened a meeting with his senior staff, under the pretense of addressing recent business developments. As he looked around the room, His gaze lingered on each face, searching for signs of guilt or duplicity. One face stood out, Igor, his longtime personal assistant. Igor had always been dependable, but in recent weeks, Artem had noticed a change in his demeanor, a nervousness that hadn't been there before. After the meeting, Artem pulled Igor aside. "I need to speak with you," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Igor hesitated, then nodded. They stepped into Artem's private office, the tension between them palpable. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Artem asked, his voice low but firm. Igor's eyes darted nervously, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me," Artem said sharply. "I know someone inside this house has been working against me. If it's you, now is your chance to come clean." For a moment Igor said nothing. Then, with a defeated sigh, he sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. "They threatened my family." "Who?" Artem demanded. "Diana and Victor," Igor admitted, his voice trembling. "They approached me months ago. They said if I didn't help them. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Artem's anger flared, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What did they ask you to do?" "Mostly small things," Igor said. "Copies of documents, details about your schedule. But recently they've been asking for more blueprints of the estate, security codes. I didn't want to do it, but I had no choice." Artem's mind raced as he processed Igor's confession. The betrayal stung, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. If Igor was willing to cooperate, he could be a valuable asset in dismantling Diana's plan. "You're going to help me," Artem said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "From now on, you report directly to me. Everything Diana and Victor tell you, every move they make, I want to know about it." Igor nodded quickly, relief evident in his expression. "Of course, whatever you need." With Igor's cooperation secured, Artem felt a renewed sense of determination. He still didn't know exactly what Diana had planned for their anniversary, but with Maxim's documents and Igor's insider knowledge, he finally had the tools to fight back. But as the clock ticked closer to the fateful evening, one question lingered in his mind: would it be enough? The morning sunlight poured through the towering windows of Artem's study, casting sharp angles of light and shadow across the room, but Artem barely noticed. His mind churned relentlessly, replaying the details Maxim had uncovered the night before. The anniversary dinner wasn't just a celebration, it was the final act in Diana's intricate scheme. A public scandal involving fabricated documents was set to detonate right before the dinner, timed perfectly to ruin his reputation. Then, before Artem could recover, legal actions and asset freezes orchestrated by Diana's allies, with Viktor Melnichenko at the center, would dismantle everything he had built. The true horror, however, was the contingency plan and accident staged to happen during the event, ensuring that if the scandal failed to destroy Artem, he wouldn't survive to fight back. Maxim's discovery of the contingency file, which detailed sabotage of the gas lines and electrical systems at the mansion, had turned the looming threat into a ticking time bomb. Artem leaned over the desk, his palms pressed hard against its surface as he fought to focus. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore, it was life-threatening. Every instinct he had screamed to confront Diana directly, to tear the truth from her lips, but he knew that would only drive her to desperation, accelerating her plans. She was too clever to reveal her hand without a fight. Maxim, sitting across from him, tapped his pen impatiently against the desk, his typically calm demeanor replaced by an edge of urgency. The two men had spent the last several hours strategizing, but no matter how they framed it, the odds were against them. Diana had spent years weaving this web, and they had less than 24 hours to untangle it. Maxim spoke first, breaking the tense silence. "We have to act on two fronts. Victor needs to be neutralized immediately. He's the backbone of her plan, and without his resources, the operation will falter. But the mansion is also a target, and we can't ignore that. If they've rigged the gas lines or tampered with the electrical systems, we need to uncover it now before it's too late. Artem nodded, his jaw tight. He had always thrived under pressure, but this felt different. It wasn't a hostile boardroom or a high-stakes negotiation. This was war, and his enemy had been sleeping beside him for 6 years. Maxim laid out their plan in exacting detail. He would personally lead a team to Victor's hideout, a discreet property in the industrial outskirts of the city, and extract any remaining information that could dismantle Diana's operation. Meanwhile, Artem would remain at the mansion, preparing for the dinner while covertly investigating the alleged sabotage. Igor, still trembling from his recent confession of betrayal, would act as a double agent, feeding Diana and Victor false information to buy them time. As Maxim left the study to gather his team, Artem remained behind, the weight of the coming hours pressing down on him like a physical force. The house was already alive with activity, the staff bustling to prepare for the evening's event. Diana, ever the flawless hostess, was overseeing the final touches in the grand ballroom. Artem watched her from a distance, his expression unreadable as she moved through the room with practiced grace, her every word and gesture meticulously designed to exude warmth and control. But Artem knew better now. That warmth was a mask, and beneath it lay a woman who had meticulously planned his destruction. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Maxim. "We've arrived at Victor's location," Maxim said, his voice low and steady. "It's heavily guarded, but we'll get through. I'll call you once we've secured him." Artem ended the call, his heart pounding. If Maxim succeeded, they might still have a chance to stop Diana. But if Victor slipped through their grasp, the consequences would be catastrophic. Time dragged as Artem awaited Maxim's next update. He busied himself by moving through the mansion, greeting guests and staff with an air of forced calm. The grand ballroom gleamed under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, the tables adorned with elegant floral arrangements and fine china. Everything was perfect, every detail a testament to Diana's vision. But to Artem, the beauty of it all felt hollow, like a carefully staged illusion designed to distract from the chaos brewing beneath the surface. Finally, Maxim's call came. Artem stepped into a secluded hallway, pressing the phone to his ear. Maxim's voice was grim. "We've got Victor." He was reluctant, but he cracked. "And you're not going to like what he told us." Artem's grip on the phone tightened. "What is it?" Maxim hesitated for a moment before responding. "The dinner is the centerpiece of her plan, but it's not the endgame. She's using the event to distract you while her people move on the company. By the time the night is over, she'll have filed a series of legal claims that will tie up your assets indefinitely. And the accident, it's not just about the gas lines. She's rigged the ballroom itself. If the documents don't destroy you, the explosion will." Artem felt a cold wave of fury and dread wash over him. "Is there a way to stop it?" Maxim exhaled sharply. "Not without exposing yourself. If Diana catches wind that we know, she'll pull the trigger early. We have to be careful, Artem." "Careful won't cut it," Artem said through gritted teeth. "This is my house, my life. I'm not letting her burn it to the ground." Ending the call, Artem turned his focus to the ballroom. If Diana had rigged the room, there had to be signs. He needed to find them, but without alerting her. As the evening progressed, Artem moved through the mansion with purpose, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the ballroom. He watched the staff closely, noting anyone who seemed out of place or nervous. Igor, under Artem's direction, discreetly questioned the technicians who had set up the lighting and sound systems. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness, but eventually, Igor approached Artem with a grim expression. "There's something," Igor said in a hushed tone. One of the technicians mentioned an unusual request from Diana. She insisted on overseeing the installation of the central chandelier. It didn't seem odd at the time, but Artem's heart sank. The chandelier was the focal point of the ballroom, a massive structure suspended directly above the main dining table. If it had been tampered with, it could easily trigger the devastation Victor had described. Artem acted quickly, enlisting Igor and a trusted security technician to examine the chandelier. Under the guise of last-minute adjustments, they inspected the structure, finding what they had feared: hidden explosives rigged to detonate remotely. Artem's stomach churned as he stared at the device, its cold, metallic surface a stark reminder of how close he had come to disaster. "We need to disarm it," Artem said, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside him. The technician hesitated. "It's complicated. If we make one wrong move," Artem cut him off. "Do it. We don't have a choice." As the technician worked, Artem kept watch, his eyes darting to the ballroom entrance every few seconds. Diana was still mingling with the guests, her laughter ringing out like the chime of a bell. She was playing her role to perfection, blissfully unaware that her plan was unraveling. When the technician finally gave a nod of confirmation, Artem felt a surge of relief. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the battle was far from over. The evening wore on, the tension building as Diana prepared to make her grand announcement. She took the stage, a vision of elegance as she raised her glass to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and confident, "thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate 6 wonderful years. Artem and I are so grateful for your friendship and support. Tonight is about reflecting on the past and looking toward the future." Artem watched her closely, his heart pounding as her speech continued. She was setting the stage for her final move, and he needed to be ready. The chandelier may have been disarmed, but Diana wasn't done yet. The documents she planned to release, the legal attacks on his company, those weapons were still in play. As Diana's speech reached its crescendo, Artem made his decision. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming control, about showing Diana that no matter how carefully she had planned, she had underestimated him. As Diana raised her glass to toast the room full of luminaries, friends, and hidden enemies, Artem's focus sharpened to a razor's edge. Her words were poised, her tone a masterful blend of charm and gravitas, but he knew the truth beneath her polished veneer. Every syllable was a step closer to unleashing the chaos she had meticulously engineered. The guests, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath their feet, clinked their glasses and laughed, their voices merging into a symphony of ignorance. Artem stood at the edge of the crowd, his body tense, his mind calculating. The chandelier might have been disarmed, but Diana's real weapon, her revelations, were still moments away. Diana's speech flowed seamlessly, weaving anecdotes about their life together with subtle allusions to the power Artem wielded. But it wasn't just a celebration. It was a setup, a carefully baited hook to draw the crowd's attention toward the grand finale. She held the room in the palm of her hand, her words a velvet glove hiding the dagger beneath. "And now," Diana said, her voice softening as she gestured toward Artem, "I want to say a few words about the man we're all here to celebrate tonight. My husband, my partner, and my greatest teacher." The room turned toward Artem, who forced a tight smile. Every eye was on him, every ear waiting for her next move. Artem's pulse quickened as Diana's expression shifted. The warmth in her eyes cooled ever so slightly, replaced by a glint of triumph that sent a chill down his spine. She stepped closer to him, her glass still raised, and the shift in her tone was so subtle that only Artem noticed it. "Artem," she continued, her voice dropping just enough to make the moment intimate, "you've taught me so much about ambition, about strength, about survival. And tonight, It's only fitting that I share with everyone here what I've learned." Her words hung in the air like a guillotine poised to drop. Artem's instincts screamed at him to act, to stop her before she could finish, but he knew one false move could send the entire room into chaos. He needed to wait, to time his counterstrike perfectly. Diana reached into her pocket and pulled out a slim, leather-bound folder. The sight of it sent a ripple of unease through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable. "These," she said, holding the folder aloft, "are documents that reveal the truth behind the man we celebrate tonight, a truth that deserves to be known." The crowd murmured, confusion and curiosity spreading like wildfire. Artem took a step forward, his voice steady but commanding. "Diana, what are you doing?" Diana's smile didn't falter. "I'm honoring you, my love. I'm showing the world the depth of your brilliance and your ruthlessness." Before Artem could respond, Diana opened the folder, pulling out a series of papers. She handed them to the nearest guest, who began reading, their face paling with every word. The papers passed from hand to hand, each guest reacting with growing shock. The room buzzed with whispers as the documents circulated. Artem's mind raced. He knew what those papers contained: false evidence of embezzlement, fraudulent deals, and criminal partnerships that painted him as a tyrant willing to destroy anyone in his path. But he also knew something Diana didn't. Maxim had spent the last several hours discrediting those very documents. His team had sent a counter-narrative to key media outlets and legal authorities, preemptively dismantling Diana's case. As the murmurs grew louder, Artem stepped into the center of the room, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Enough." "Huh." The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Diana's smile faltered for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "I won't deny it," Artem began, his voice calm but firm. "I am ambitious. I am ruthless when it comes to protecting what I've built. But these documents? They're a fabrication, a desperate attempt to tarnish my name. And I have proof." He gestured toward Maxim, who stepped forward with a tablet in hand. The screen displayed a series of emails, timestamps, and financial records, evidence that discredited every claim in Diana's folder. Maxim spoke with measured authority, detailing how the documents had been falsified, how Diana and Victor had orchestrated the scheme. The crowd's murmurs shifted, confusion giving way to outrage not at Artem, but at Diana. Faces turned toward her, expressions hardening as the truth began to sink in. Diana's composure cracked, her smile twisting into a mask of fury. "You think this changes anything?" She spat, her voice rising. "You think you can outsmart now?" Artem took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "I already have." For a moment the room was silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Then Diana lunged toward him, her movements wild and desperate. Artem caught her wrists, his grip firm but restrained. "It's over, Diana," he said quietly. But Diana wasn't done. "You think you've won," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You think this ends here? You have no idea what's coming." As the words left her lips, a deafening explosion rocked the mansion. The chandelier above them, though disarmed, shuddered violently as a secondary device detonated somewhere in the building. Guests screamed, the crowd scattering in panic as debris rained down. Artem pulled Diana toward the nearest exit, shielding her from the chaos despite everything. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice filled with equal parts rage and desperation. Diana laughed bitterly. "I told you, Artem, you can't win." Maxim appeared at his side, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "The blast came from the east wing," he said quickly. "We need to get out now." Artem nodded, dragging Diana with him as they navigated the wreckage. The once beautiful mansion was now a war zone, flames licking at the walls and smoke filling the air. They emerged into the cool night, the roar of sirens growing louder in the distance. Diana collapsed to her knees on the lawn, her face streaked with soot and tears. For the first time, she looked fragile, broken. Artem knelt beside her, his voice low but unyielding. "Why, Diana? Why go this far?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with hatred and sorrow. "Because you took everything from me. Your father destroyed my family, my future. I was going to make you feel that same pain." Artem stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. For all her brilliance, her ruthlessness, Diana had been driven by a wound that had festered for years. And now, in the ruins of their life together, he felt the hollow ache of loss, not just for what she had done, but for what they could have been. The police arrived moments later, pulling Diana away as she screamed curses at Artem. Maxim placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression weary. "It's over," he said. Artem watched as the authorities led Diana into the back of a police car, her defiance giving way to quiet resignation. The mansion smoldered behind them, a monument to the destruction wrought by revenge. But Artem felt no triumph, no sense of victory. He had survived, yes, but at what cost? The life he had built, the love he had believed in, it was all gone. As he stood there, the cold night air biting at his skin, one thought consumed him. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The mansion was gone, reduced to a smoldering ruin. Artem stood at the edge of the lawn, staring at what remained of the life he had built. The acrid scent of smoke hung in the air, mingling with the cold bite of the night. Around him, firefighters doused the last of the flames while police officers cordoned off the property, their radios crackling with fragmented updates. But Artem heard none of it. The chaos outside was nothing compared to the storm within him. Diana was gone now, taken into custody, her defiance etched into her face even as she was forced into the back of a police car. She hadn't begged for forgiveness or tried to deny what she had done. Instead, she had looked at Artem one last time, her lips curling into a faint smile that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't the smile of a defeated woman. It was the smile of someone who believed the game wasn't over. Maxim approached from behind, his face bruised and streaked with soot. "They've secured the perimeter," he said, his voice low. "The bomb squad is sweeping the rest of the property, but it looks like the worst is over." The worst? Artem's voice was a bitter rasp. He gestured toward the ruins of his home. "Look around, Maxim. It's all gone. Everything she touched, everything I let her touch." Maxim placed a steadying hand on Artem's shoulder. "You're still here. That's what matters." But Artem wasn't so sure. For years he had built his empire with the belief that control was everything. He had controlled his company, his reputation, his life. And yet Diana had unraveled it all in a matter of hours. How had he let her get so close? How had he missed the signs? "You need to leave the city for a while," Maxim said, his tone firm. "Let the authorities handle the fallout. Victor's people will scatter now that he's in custody, but there are others, Diana's allies, her network. They'll regroup. You can't be here when that happens." Artem nodded slowly, the weight of exhaustion settling over him. He didn't argue because he didn't have the strength. Maxim was right, staying would only make him a target. But leaving felt like a surrender, a retreat from the ruins of a battle he wasn't ready to let go of. 2 weeks later, Artem found himself on the coast, far from the city that had been his kingdom. He had retreated to a small villa perched on the cliffs, its isolation offering a strange mix of solace and suffocation. The days passed in a haze of restless contemplation. He woke early, walked along the rocky shoreline, and spent hours staring out at the sea, its endless horizon both mocking and comforting. Maxim called regularly, keeping him updated on the fallout. Diana had refused to cooperate with the authorities, her silence only deepening the mystery of how far her network extended. Victor, on the other hand, had begun to talk, revealing names and connections that implicated some of the city's most powerful figures. Maxim had assured Artem that the company's assets were safe for now, thanks to the countermeasures they had implemented, but the damage to his reputation was harder to repair. The fabricated documents Diana had released had left a stain that even Maxim's best efforts couldn't fully erase. Despite the distance, Artem felt her presence everywhere. Diana had been more than a threat, she had been a mirror, reflecting back the flaws and vulnerabilities he had spent years hiding from. Her betrayal was a wound that refused to heal, not because of what she had taken, but because of what she had revealed about him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Artem sat at the edge of the cliffs, a bottle of whiskey at his side. The rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below was the only sound, a steady pulse in the quiet expanse. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded page he had taken from her diary, the one he hadn't been able to burn with the rest. The words stared back at him, haunting in their simplicity. "You were never my enemy, Artem. You were my greatest lesson." He crumpled the page in his fist, the anger and confusion threatening to consume him once more. But this time, something stopped him. The words, as cruel as they felt, carried a strange truth. Diana hadn't just sought to destroy him, she had sought to teach him something. The next morning, Artem called Maxim. "It's time to rebuild," he said, his voice steady. "You're ready?" Maxim asked, skepticism laced in his tone. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready," Artem admitted. "But I can't stay here. If I let her win, if I let her define what comes next, then she's succeeded. And I won't give her that satisfaction." Returning to the city was like stepping into a battlefield long after the fighting had ended. His mansion was gone, replaced by a skeleton of scaffolding and construction crews working tirelessly to restore what had been lost. The office was quieter than he remembered, the usual energy replaced by a cautious tension. His employees avoided his gaze, their whispers trailing behind him like ghosts. Artem threw himself into the work, rebuilding not just his company but his identity. He met with clients, partners, and investors, acknowledging the damage Diana's actions had caused but refusing to let it define him. He knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar: humility. Months passed, and the city began to forget. The headlines shifted to new scandals, new dramas, leaving Artem to rebuild in relative peace. But the scars remained, both visible and invisible. One day, Maxim arrived at Artem's office, his expression unreadable. He placed a file on the desk and leaned back, his arms crossed. "What is it?" Artem asked, opening the file. Inside were photographs, surveillance reports, and financial records, traces of Diana's network that had surfaced in recent weeks. Her allies were still out there, operating in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. "She's still pulling strings," Maxim said. "Even from prison, she's keeping the game alive." Artem closed the file, his expression hardening. "Then we end it." The following months became a quiet war. Artem, with Maxim at his side, methodically dismantled what remained of Diana's network. One by one, her allies were exposed, their schemes unraveled before they could take root. It was a relentless pursuit, driven not by revenge, but by a need for closure. In the end, it wasn't victory Artem found, it was understanding. Diana's betrayal had forced him to confront the man he had become, the choices that had led him to this point. And while the pain of her actions would never fully fade, he found strength in the lessons she had left behind. One evening, as he stood on the balcony of his rebuilt mansion, Artem looked out over the city that had both made and broken him. He thought of Diana not with anger, but with a quiet sense of resolve. She had sought to destroy him, but in doing so, she had given him the opportunity to rebuild something stronger. and for that he was strangely grateful.